All right, Ed, how much of an appreciation for globalization did you get from this book?
Wow. I mean, so I guess I started with like one view of how the world fitted together, and you're kind of basing it off, I guess, what you hear in the media a lot of the time. You know, you're basing it off the moods of Donald Trump and Joe Biden and things like Brexit, and you get this impression, definitely the place where we are at the moment in the world, you get this impression that we are kind of rapidly deglobalizing, and that people are reshoring, they're moving back production, to their domestic areas. But the funny thing is that having kind of gone on this journey, you are just completely taken aback by the fact that these interlinkages all around the world, and it's quite an inspiring story, the interlinkages all around the world when it comes to flows of materials, flows of goods, flows of commodities, the whole thing are just so much greater than you'd appreciate. Whether it's metals, whether it's things like, copper going all around the world to be refined in one place, put into a wire somewhere else. You've got atoms of copper from one part of the world and another part of the world mingling together. It's quite a kind of exciting thing to just see all of these flows of goods. And for the time being, at least, there's been a lot of talk about reshoring, and actually some of the stuff, I'm sure we can talk about this, like the Inflation Reduction Act and the Chips Act, some of the measures that we've seen recently in the US, that looks like it will bring some production home. But the nature of globalization, the nature of this world that is so interlinked and where it is just a web of different relationships, I was taken aback by how much deeper that was than I expected. Even as someone who covers this stuff on a daily basis, the amount of distance that a piece of silicon travels to go around the world before it becomes part of a silicon chip is crazy. Like, it's crazy. It's much more than I had expected. And again, there's lots of cliches that I kind of found myself, as part of this journey, challenging, like one of which is being that China is just utterly dominant in anything when it comes to making anything. Well, it turns out that's not the case. It's not the case for semiconductors. It's not the case for even the silicon that goes into semiconductors. It's not the case for a lot of other materials as well. And I don't know if the conventional wisdom is very helpful on a lot of this stuff. And that's, I guess, why I've gone into this, for me, unusual place of just trying to look from the bottom up rather than the top down. And it's not that necessarily there's a grand new economic vision you can get out of that, but I feel that you do get some authenticity and some truth and some connection to how the world works that I just didn't have before. Yeah, and part of that is that globalization is it is the bedrock for how our world works. And if that comes to an end, or if we have to reshore a lot of those activities, that too is a far bigger deal than I think most people appreciate.
A ridiculously big deal.
It's a massively big deal. And I think we can be, politicians are going to obviously give you easy answers. And we've had a lot of easy answers in the UK over the course of the last kind of 5-6 years with Brexit. A lot of people saying it's going to be fine, it's going to be easy. Well, it turns out it's tough. Yeah. It's tough, and it's not necessarily the end of the world, any of these decisions. And that's the other problem, is that on the one hand, with Brexit in particular, I don't want to make this whole conversation about Brexit, because that's always the risk. But on the one hand, but it is useful to talk about, because it is an interesting experiment, isn't it? In this new brave new world of countries kind of deglobalizing to some extent. Because that's basically what
pretending
Brexit
to be
is.
self-reliant.
Yeah, pretending to be self-reliant, insisting that trade flows, that they can influence trade flows, that the gravity models that economists go on about don't necessarily matter. Well, they do, and actually Brexit started off being, in theory, a relatively minor, kind of leaving a relatively minor dent, depending on how you do it. It turns out that the way that UK kind of the line the route the UK chose was the more dramatic kind of breakage or breakaway. But also, at the time in 2016, when Britain voted to leave, I mean, I was going to say it wasn't very obvious, but like it was a bit obvious to some people, but it wasn't obvious to most people that we would now be living, in 2023 in this other world where there is lots of talk, at least, about countries kind of returning into blocks and that era of untrammeled globalization potentially coming to an end. As I say, it's not at an end yet. We are still massively linked, and there's still a big open question mark as to how much of this stuff can come home. But it feels like it is a slightly different world now to one that we were in 2016. Definitely.
In the appreciation for globalization, was it that you mentioned you were taken back several times just then? Were you taken back by how impressive the entire system is, how it works, or were you taken back by the fragility of it?
Well, a bit of both. Yeah, I mean, it goes back to that Leonard Read essay, I Pencil. You probably read it.
Terrific anecdote.
It's an amazing, and this was like 1950s, and I'm sure many of your listeners will have come across it. I Pencil, this essay, which is written from the point of view of the pencil. So it's saying I'm a pencil, and it goes through the various different stages it takes to make the pencil, all the way from the wood and where the wood is milled, what happens to it, it's slatted and treated and so on. All the way through, and oil goes on it, and the oil comes from somewhere else entirely, and then you've got the eraser, and you've got the lead, the graphite in there, and all of the different places all over the world that comes from, and it all kind of coalesces together to become a pencil, and no single person knows how to make the pencil. And you could basically take pretty much any product in the modern world, anything, especially electronics, and apply the same thing to it, except it would be an even more marvelous world where no one actually understood. There was no architect, there is no blind watchmaker, or there is a blind watchmaker. There's no one who actually has the blueprint as to how to make all of this stuff, including semiconductors, which is the one that I kind of spent a lot of time thinking about. And it happens, and yet it happens, and that was there were two kind of messages for when Leonard Read was writing this essay in the 1950s. One was, isn't this amazing? No single person knows how to do this, but it just happens. And there is complexity in this world. And even simple things have marvelous stories about humankind turning simple substances into things that we can actually use every day. We are still tool makers. We are still tool makers even now. But the second message was, given that there's no single person who knows how to do all of this stuff, central planning is basically doomed. And so at the time, that was the thing that Milton Friedman, for instance, who really made this a famous essay, was keen to emphasize. But I guess my revelation, and I remember vividly the first time I read that and just being like, wow, like that's how you make a pencil. That's so inspiring. What about the rest of the world? What about everything else?
Yeah.
What about like paper, And it turns out that it's a similarly complex supply chain for all of these things. Even with paper, there are enormous kind of stages of process that you need to get to between it being wood and pulp and then being paper. And along the way, you need chemicals. And where do those chemicals come from? Well, that's a whole separate story as well. A lot of them, by the way, come from salt, which is one of the things that makes salt such an unexpectedly fascinating substance that is still a bedrock of the world today. So, I mean, all of those things together are inspiring. But there is, to go back to your question, there is a fragility in that in some cases, because we have this increasingly, we've lived in a world over the course of the past, few decades where a lot, because it is a big global market, has been about price and about reducing the price as much as possible and being as efficient as possible. And being as efficient as possible sometimes means, stripping away some competition. And the upshot is that in some cases we are very reliant on single sources, whether it's the country for the most part, but in some cases single places where we get stuff from, and that's inherently fragile. One of the most striking things that places I've visited in the last few years is this plant in Cheshire in the UK, so just on the border of Wales. Beautiful part of the world. This is where the majority of the UK's salt comes from. And there's a long history going back to the kind of Victorian era where we got our salt from there. And actually, for a long time, Cheshire salt, they called it Liverpool salt because it was shipped via Liverpool. But Cheshire salt was sold all over the world. In Africa, they were obsessed with Cheshire salt. I mean, it's salt. It's not, it doesn't taste any different to salt anywhere else. But they had a kind of stranglehold over the entire global market. Well, one of the striking things, again, is that, and by the way, the environmental conditions there were terrible. The place was shrouded in kind of acrid coal smoke because you're burning a lot of coal to evaporate the brine that comes out of the ground. You had areas that people had mined under the ground. There were collapses in some of the mines, so you've got these enormous indentations throughout Cheshire, and they're still there, by the way. They're called flashes, little lakes that suddenly you kind of go over a hillock and you see this strange lake that doesn't have any rivers going into it. Well, it turns out that's the result of a kind of flooded mine many years ago. It's a pool, and it's quite salty water because there's salt underneath. Anyway, one of the most striking places I visited. Sorry, I've got a habit of going on tangents on this because there's so much. But one of the most fascinating and also, I guess, fragile places I visited is this plant where they are taking that brine. So they're still taking the salt out, and they are doing right now. Actually, in the UK, we are making about double, if not more, the amount of salt that we were back in that golden era when we were selling it all over the world. But the vast majority of it goes not into the stuff that we sprinkle on our chips, but into chemicals. And this particular plant is taking brine, it runs it through a lot of electrolyzers. It's an enormous kind of room where they've got one electrolyzer after another. And these electrolytic cells produce a few things. They produce hydrogen, but they also produce chlorine. And so you're kind of taking apart the sodium chloride as well, and and you can make bleach from it, and you can get hydrogen from it, but the chlorine is really important because that chlorine that they make in that place purifies about 95% of all of the drinking water in this country, and it's one room. It's one room, and it's one room that the vast majority of the population are completely oblivious of. Yeah. And you feel kind of terrified there. And one of the people there said, if this place goes down, and by the way, it is a very energy intensive place because you're running a lot of power into these cells to rip apart the brine, the water and salt that's your kind of input. In fact, the amount of power that goes into that place is single room is more than powers the city of Liverpool. So the whole city of Liverpool for one room. If that place went down, if there's some catastrophic power cut, I mean, they've got lots of lines going in, so it's not going to happen, or something terrible happens, then we are rationing drinking water in this country within 7 days or so. Right. One place. And it's not like, and actually chlorine is quite difficult to ship because it's quite kind of volatile. Okay. So it's not obvious how you deal with that very easily. We'd find a way. And one of, I think, the lessons that I've learned.
But it's a massive inefficiency in the supply chain.
Yeah, it's a massive efficiency in that it's very, it's very.
I should say fragility.
Yeah, but it's
a
massive,
so hyper efficient.
Exactly.
You can't allow
exactly. I think that's the thing, and that's one of kind of many examples, which both. Well, it's interesting to understand where this stuff comes from, but it's also slightly worrying when you realise that that's it. What I guess I've tried to do. In the course of the last few years researching and then writing is try to understand what we're standing on. What is the foundation? When you look down, you're not supposed to look down. But here, we're looking down and we're seeing the stuff, the bedrock that we're standing on. And suddenly you're like, oh, hang on, okay, so that's it. And yeah, like I say, it's both exciting but unsettling, and it goes for so many of those substances as well.
You did say in the introduction to the book a bit of a throwaway line, but I thought it summarized it really well. Just it's a book about the stuff we're running out of under the ground, which was nice. But before we look at the specific material, I just want to ask one more globalization broad related question, because you have many of the cliche lessons of globalization, the specialized labor, the removal of artisans, bringing the cost all the way down, hyper efficiency, destruction of culture, all this sort of stuff. But I wonder in your research, whether there are any non-cliche lessons of globalization that you stumbled across.
Well, that's a good question. I mean, I mean, so a lot of, well, I suppose there is still a kind of reliance that we can't kind of get away from on natural resources, like it or not. Mm-hmm. You know, where stuff I think we think these days that we've transcended all of that stuff.
Like it's all recycled or something.
It's all recyclable. That if we run short of something, we'll just synthesize it. Yeah?
Right.
But it doesn't really work that way. And like even if you can synthesize certain things, often it's kind of much more expensive. Actually, really like the only really good example of us running out of something mineral and then synthesizing it is artificial fertilizer. I mean, maybe there are others, and I'd be interested if your listeners can think of other examples. But I haven't found anything else. But that, getting nitrogen from the air rather than from rocks, turns out to be like a massive deal, and that was a kind of great thing. For everything else, you still kind of need the basic stuff out of the ground. And there, your natural abundance or otherwise kind of matters. So China has tried for years and years, for decades, to try and build its own iron ore mining sector, and they've put so many billions of dollars into it, and just haven't managed to do it because Australia there is nowhere like the Pilbara.
Yeah.
You know, God created it.
That was such a cool chapter. It made me want to go there so much.
Yeah, no,
you could just pick
crazy.
up a rock off the floor and it'd be heavier than a normal rock.
Yeah, no, and they are. When you kind of feel iron ore, it's like, wow, that's and also it's kind of the rust comes off on your fingers on these rocks, so it is rust literally on your fingers. But so I suppose it's that you know, I don't know whether it's a cliche or not a cliche, but it's not just globalization. It's where the stuff is still matters, and I guess we'll talk about there are certain things within these materials which just happen to be in certain countries, like random things like niobium. Basically, all of the world's niobium is in a few mines in Brazil, and you need that stuff if you're going to make certain types of steel. And no one's that. Everyone's pretty relaxed about it because Brazil's relatively stable. You've never had any problems with these mines. But again, where stuff comes out of the ground matters. And our ability to turn it into other things is where globalization kind of, that's where it begins and kind of leaps off from. And that's, again, the story of human endeavor has been about creating massive supply chains across the world that turn something simple into something complex. And this is the other thing that I guess I hope comes across. It's not just about having the most amazing gadget. It's the fact that we can turn this stuff out on a mass. We can mass produce it, and that's such a big deal, but it's often discounted.
That's the great achievement of ASML.
Right. Totally. Yeah. ASML, but and TSMC, okay, because ASML make these amazing machines. But it's interesting that even Intel can't make them work at scale, or has struggled to thus far. And so it's that kind of combination of even having the best machines in the world, you still need to kind of apply them into a kind of mass production matrix.
So are Intel
and
also
Samsung,
using the EUV
well.
machine?
Yeah, they've got EUV.
But they can't do it
Intel
efficiently.
were one of the earliest. I don't know if you covered this in your ASML episode, but Intel were one of the earliest investors. In fact, I think they put the most money into EUV early on. And this is the amazing thing. Actually, it's like we're still human beings with some tools, and working out how to use those tools turns out to be just as difficult as making the tool in the first place. I mean, you've got the sci-fi of what happens in the EUV machine. It's just mental. It's crazy. It's crazy. You wouldn't make it up, would you?
Just to highlight how mental it is, tell the anecdote of the drops of tin.
Oh, I find that amazing. So you, in order to create, okay, so can I start and
start with a plane of glass, actually.
Well, what I find like amazing, because I've seen probably, you'll have seen all those pictures of the circuit boards that turn out to be from a few years ago, blown up a lot, and you're like, oh, look at all those little transistors, and you can see these tiny little grooves in them, and it's like, look at how small they are. That's amazing. But what I find kind of amazing is when you look at a modern microchip, the thing that's in your iPhone, something with this kind of 5 nanometer length or 7 nanometer length, that the size of the transistor is so small that even if you blew up that photograph as far as you could with anything optical, you would still just see a flat surface because the wavelength of light is longer than the transistors. It's crazy. Isn't that crazy?
And humans managed to print that with accuracy.
Yeah, we did that with kind of, and that's the other interesting thing about semiconductors. I mean, we shouldn't make the whole thing about semiconductors, but they are quite useful. But it's also the yield. So again, it's turning out kind of 90% reliable chips rather than turning out kind of 50%. The success or otherwise of a semiconductor plant, it turns out, isn't just about making the smallest transistors. It's about kind of having the most kind of reliability and accuracy. But back to the tin. In order to make that thing that's so small that you can't even see it, you need a wavelength of light that is smaller, shorter than the normal wavelength of visible light, which is the extreme ultraviolet light, in an invisible form of light. And obviously it's a fragile form of light, and we have basically there was a long period where no one was sure. They knew it existed in theory, but they didn't know how to generate it. It's not like you can buy a kind of LED bulb that
torch.
Yeah, a torch, exactly. And so they went through, and I'm trying to think whether it was the 90s, but and this is the thing that Intel put a lot of money into, working out how to produce it. And the way that there must have been one of these crazy meetings where you've got a kind of scientist, boffin character coming in and saying, okay, so what I'm thinking is we're gonna take a drop of molten tin and we'll drop it inside a vacuum canister that's only got, I think, argon inside it. And we'll drop it, and it'll be dropping, kind of a breakneck speed. And as it's falling midway through the air, we're going to smash it, not just once, but twice, with 2 laser blasts from, it turns out, the world's most powerful laser, a kind of set of plasma lasers, which will kind of flatten it into a pancake and then vaporize it, essentially. And it so happens when it gets vaporized, a bit of EUV light radiation, whatever you want to call it, this invisible light, gets created. And then we need to find some way of collecting that light. And then, only then, can you kind of begin to bounce it off other lenses. And that is actually what happens inside these machines. It's the tin is falling. The drops are small, and the tin is falling so fast that you can't see it. And obviously, you can't see inside these things anyway. But it's falling so fast that you wouldn't be able to see it. But I don't know how many kind of microseconds it is blasted with 2 blasts of this incredible laser, and then that creates this crazy light that we have only just worked out how to actually do. And by the way, what I find kind of inspiring about this story, and I think it's inspiring, I think there are lessons not just for the technology of kind of making computers and stuff, but also for things like climate change and the energy transition. There is so much that people say right now is too difficult to do. So much. EUV was one of those things. Everyone, or at least a lot of people, said they didn't think it was possible to achieve that, let alone to do it on a mass production basis, which is what's happening right now in Taiwan and South Korea. So anyway, the EUV light, this invisible light radiation is created in this little kind of container. It then gets collected by these extraordinary lenses, which funnel it down a series of other mirrors, and eventually it ends up, and at this point it's so incredibly small because of the optics that's going on here. And it comes back to the fact that the reason you're using light to do this is that conventional tools are just incapable, even, atomic layer deposition, are incapable of the kind of precision you get when you're using light and reflecting it down, like a kind of the inversion of a movie camera. So it's starting with a big design, all of your transistors. And incidentally, the size of those, if you were to blow up those circuit boards, the master boards that you're then kind of projecting down and etching onto chips, if you were to blow them up, I think the statistic was it would be like, so that you could see the transistors, I think this little master board itself would be the size of the height of the Burj Khalifa in Dubai. It kind of boggles the mind. But they are doing this and using this invisible light that no one thought we'd ever be able to create on a mass production basis every day of the week in South Korea and Taiwan, and as a result turning out chips, all for just chips that are basically a little bit faster than the ones that came before them. That's the other amazing thing about Moore's law. Yeah. All for just, slightly faster chips, and we still, try to log on our phone and a bit like, oh, it's a bit slow. Why is it so slow? It is, there's nanotechnology that's happening when you're trying to just swipe up your phone and open it. And that to me is one of the wonders of the world. And it's one of the wonders of the world, not just because of how amazing that technology is, but as I say, we've had amazing things in the past. Think of, like, people always think of Concorde, this supersonic jet, and they're like, why don't we have Concorde these days? Well, Concorde was obviously amazing in certain respects, but it was only the 0.1 or 0.01% of the population would ever be able to travel on Concorde. It was not something for the masses. These chips are the absolute the bleeding edge, the leading edge of technology, and we all have them. Even people in developing countries, can have them in their Samsungs, and they are just extraordinary. And so I think that's something that is unappreciated because I think because we take a lot of this stuff for granted, again, because we probably spend a bit less time than we could thinking about, I'm sure not you, I'm sure not many of your listeners, but a lot of people don't think all that much about this stuff because they've been convinced for a long time that we're living in this ethereal world where physical stuff doesn't really matter anymore.
If it's cheap and it's ubiquitous and you see everyone have it and you have multiple versions of the same phone, it kind of makes total sense why you would stop to appreciate actually what goes into it, where it comes from. But that's the wonder. Humans famously cannot conceptualize scale. Right. Yeah. And this is maybe another example of that.
I suppose so. Yeah. But you're totally right. It's ubiquity means we kind of take it for granted. But I think it's the fact that we can take stuff for granted. That's what's amazing. Right. That's what's amazing. But it just it leads to complacency. And who are the people? If the vast majority of the population, probably the vast majority of politicians, are of that mind, then who are the people who are going to kind of drive this forward, who are going to ensure that we can actually continue to breed this success without taking it for granted? That's what I slightly wonder about. That I wonder if that's why it's in places like kind of Taiwan, South Korea, where there has been more industrial strategy in the past, that you find these places rather than Intel, or for that matter here in the UK, where we just don't have a semiconductor industry anymore.
From your book, though, something interesting I learned was how it was rather serendipitous that Taiwan ended up being the capital. And if you could explain why it was that all of these Chinese students happened to be studying X in the US versus now maybe they're doing software development.
It's a thesis. I mean, it's a thesis, but it's one that I've heard actually from a couple of people within the semiconductor industry. And could you explain? And I love it. Yeah. So basically, the thesis goes like this: when obviously Taiwan opened up and was sending its students over to the US and to Europe to study before China, and it so happened that at that point that they sent those students out abroad. And the obvious example is someone like Morris Chang, who was the founder of TSMC, an extraordinary character.
Founded in his 50s.
Yeah, how founded in his 50s. And this is a guy who can remember the communists coming to power. He can remember World War II, being in, I think, Shanghai or Hong Kong during World War II. And is still alive, and is an extraordinary figure. But those kinds of people, in that particular cohort, when they left Taiwan and they went to study abroad, it just so happened that was the period when it was the early days of the Silicon, revolution. And in those early days, the companies that were kind of rising to the top were places like kind of Intel, Texas Instruments, Fairchild, all these companies which were making silicon chips. In some cases, physically making it before the US had outsourced that to Asia. And so their education was somewhat more skewed towards physical computer engineering. It was skewed towards actual hardware. Roll on a few decades and China is sending its And those people, by the way, from Taiwan would come back, and they'd come back with expertise. And Maurice Chang obviously is a kind of great example. He worked in those early days at Texas Instruments. He understood how you actually get yield out of a semiconductor. And that's the point, is these boring things about getting the most yield you possibly can from a silicon wafer, the most chips that actually work. He got that. He was really good at that at Texas Instruments. And roll on a few decades, China is sending its students to the US. And at that point, the companies in the ascendancy are places like Microsoft. It's services-based companies. And lo and behold, those students come back to China and they're not setting up semiconductor companies. They're setting up TikTok. They're setting up, Alibaba. They're setting up services companies. And, the extent to which that there's a direct line between those things, I don't know. It's a great anecdote, and definitely people within the semiconductor industry talk about that. But it underlines that what matters here, to a large extent, when it comes to semiconductors, is skill and expertise, and having a culture of manufacturing and making stuff. And the irony in China is that right now, the government there, the authorities are desperate to do everything they can to create a semiconductor industry, but they've really struggled. Even before, it's worth saying, even before things like the CHIPS Act, even before the US sanctions on places like ASML, which say they can't send those extraordinary machines to China, which is really problematic because ASML is the only company in the world that can make that stuff. But even before that, China was really struggling to create a semiconductor industry. And that's partly because you need the people who know how to do it, and most of those people these days, at least, are in Taiwan and South Korea. And right now, there was a story just the other day about someone who defected from South Korea to China to try and run one of these semiconductor companies. And what I love about kind of taking the long view on these things, okay, that sounds about as modern as you could get. It's China, it's South Korea, it's semiconductors, it's silicon, but actually, if you look back through history, that kind of thing has happened time and time again throughout history. I mean, so just to stay with silicon, the earliest kind of industrial subterfuge on silicon was all about glass. And it was all about the people who knew not how to make semiconductors, but how to make glass. Exactly the same thing. And for a long period, those people were kind of smuggled from one country to another. And they were asked not to leave. So the glassmakers of Murano in Venice, who made the first really truly clear glass, they originally actually had come from, I think, Constantinople. But once they were in Murano, the authorities were like, well, you're not leaving. We're not letting you out, because glass is amazing. And it was, and it is. Glass at the time was the most advanced technology in the world, comfortably. And in some ways, actually, it still is. And it was thanks to glass. It is not for nothing. It's not coincidental that things like the barometer and the thermometer and the discovery of kind of getting kind of alcohol and various other, and actually for that matter, the Renaissance, but that's another issue entirely. It is not for nothing that stuff was happening around kind of Venice in Italy at the very same time that this was the best place in the world for making glass. But, back to those semiconductors. Throughout the following centuries, from the kind of 15th century onwards, you constantly had the British, the French, the Dutch trying to lure those technicians from Venice over to their countries to show them how to make glass in exactly the same way that China is trying to lure people from Taiwan and South Korea over to make semiconductors. So this stuff, tech transfer, industrial subterfuge, it has always been the way. And it's just that we're in a different chapter now with the technology, still silicon technology, but it's got a slightly different name. And I think we think in our kind of quite modern way that it's all novel, and that, that we are living in this kind of bold new age where we're kind of reimagining the future. Well, kind of not really. We've got there are echoes throughout, and we have our feet totally in the past as well as in the present.
You could also we'll make this the last point on semiconductors, because there's so much more to the book as well. But thinking about, at least drawing back into the opening point about the fragility and the hyper efficiency of globalization, you could almost say that ASML is a caricature or archetype of perfect globalization, because you went to Lederhoven, I'm sure, and saw that there is there is a software engineer from every corner of the planet, a hardware engineer from every corner of the planet. They're all working together. It's like it's not a Dutch place. It's an international place.
It's international, and it also, I mean, that goes for the products themselves. So you look at the whatever it's called, the Twin Scan NXC, the big machine which is doing all that crazy stuff with extreme ultraviolet light. The machine itself is put together by ASML, but the parts that go inside it are from, I don't know whether it's hundreds or thousands, but so many different partners. And ASML describe themselves as being this supply chain manager, really, because while they make the machines and while they the stuff inside, and that again is the exciting thing. So it's a Dutch company, okay, and the world and technology as we know it is dependent on this single Dutch company, which is crazy. But the single Dutch company itself is also dependent completely on a German company to provide the lasers. Trumpf provides the lasers. That's as I say, some of the most powerful lasers in the world. This place is the world leader in making these lasers. So they're dependent on them. I mean, maybe you could find one or two better places, but there's quite a kind of limited number of places where it can make those lasers. Same thing with lenses. So those amazing lenses that are collecting the enhanced ultraviolet light or extreme ultraviolet light and bouncing it off. That's actually another German company, Zeiss, which has a long history, which I go on about in the book, which is brilliant and fascinating. But that you need these other companies. So when you're looking at something like ASML, when you're looking at these machines that can create nanotechnology, what you're seeing is this kind of is an embodiment of globalization. You're seeing an embodiment of companies who are the very best at doing what they do, and in some cases have been doing it for decades, if not centuries, who are then putting their kind of materials inside. And I find that, again, both exciting, but also, I get a little bit scary. But that's, but it's the same thing for us. If you're using your phone, it's exactly the same thing. Apple doesn't make their phones. They design them and they kind of engineer what they're going to look like, but they don't do any of the manufacturing themselves. They don't make any of the components inside themselves. It is all made by other companies. And putting these things together, and rather than coming up with a mongoloid thing that doesn't necessarily work, having an amazing end product, that is what ASML does, but it's what Apple does as well. And again, that's inspiring because, wow, that's they are able to take the best of everything and put it into one single box. And
you say it's inspiring because of what you said earlier, thinking about climate change or maybe other giant existential issues. Potentially, technology could actually solve these issues.
I think, I mean, EUV is a really good example. Because no one thought that was possible. But you could go back, a lot of people doubted whether you could make a solid-state semiconductor, solid-state switch. So the semiconductor in the first place, when it replaced, vacuum tubes, those valves, those glass valves, a lot of people were just skeptical that you were able to do it. So, and we lost the recipe for cement and concrete for more than 1,000 years. And then we rediscovered it. No one thought for a long period that we would be able to make soda ash. So soda ash is another one of those amazingly important chemicals that comes out of salt these days. But at the time, in I think the 18th century, a lot of people doubted that we would be able to get soda ash from salt. There was one of those grand competitions organised by the French government. I don't know if it was the king or I think it was the king. It was just before the revolution, so it was Louis, and it was just before the revolution, and he laid down this challenge that, can someone out there take salt and turn it into soda ash? And soda ash was massively important because, like I say, it's just one of those chemicals we use to convert one thing into another all around the world. So glass is a really good example. You can't make glass without soda ash because it's your flux that helps the sand to melt, because it's really got a high melting point sand. At the time, a lot of people doubted that was going to be possible. And throughout history, people have done it. They did it for for salt and soda ash. The story there is a rather sad one because the guy who did it, he's called Leblanc. He came up with a discovery, and basically, by the time he came up, so there was a big prize that the king had offered, and by the time he came up with the discovery, the revolution had just hit. The king was on the run. He didn't get his prize money, and then also because there was just chaos throughout France, his factory was, I think, seized by the revolutionaries. They took his secrets on how to do it, and I think basically sold it off abroad. And eventually he died. I don't know if he killed himself or he died, broken-hearted a few years later. But it's rather a sad story. But he still did it. He managed to achieve this amazing thing. And subsequently we've worked out a better way of doing it. But I think if we look back and we remind ourselves of, at the time, there were always people who doubt that you can do it. And it's the most, insurmountable thing. And it's always a few decades away. And in some cases, things do take a long time to develop. But look at EUV, look at salt and soda ash, look at concrete, look at all of these innovations that have happened over the last, few centuries, which we need for our lives to stay alive. How many things that we're now doubtful about, whether it's fusion or geothermal, how many of these things that look like they're pretty insurmountable right now, will we still in kind of will our children or their grandchildren feel exactly as complacent as we do right now about EUV?
Yeah,
probably quite a few of them.
It's a really nice. Well, nice is such a bad word. It's an extremely optimistic way of thinking about the future, because it is way easier to cast doubt into something that's extremely difficult and doesn't have a precedence of having happened.
Totally.
But until it's happened, nothing's have a precedent of
totally.
being happened.
And
so
then it happens, and then the world's changed. But often it's like gradual, and the world changes in a kind of gradual, in an invisible way. Like no one cares.
And then
about
a few
EUV.
generations later, they'll appreciate that moment when that person managed to do it.
Yeah, well, hopefully.
Yeah, or maybe not.
Or not. Maybe that's
Right.
maybe that's the supreme achievement of humankind, is that we can create this world that is comfortable and that where as many people as possible can be fed and be satisfied and live good lives without having to feel enormous gratitude about it. Maybe that's it. I mean, like it or not, because that's kind of where we are with a lot of this technology. No one very grateful for soda ash, but maybe we should be.
An absolutely crazy statistic, which again, every point in this book just keeps reaffirming how incredible the systems are that we've built, but then also like how fragile the systems are as well. So obviously oil, I'm sure a lot of the audience realize that it's in almost everything. I'd like you to, after this question, say exactly the things that it's in, because there are a lot of surprising things as well. But this statistic was completely insane. We will have to produce more food in the next 40 years than all the food that has been produced in the last 8,000. And this is compounded by scarcer water, scarcer land, and less nutrient-dense soil.
That's.
How can that be? Maybe explain why or how that could be the case.
Well, I mean, it's kind of extrapolating population growth and food demand, and the fact definitely, I hope something that kind of comes across in the book is that we do consume an extraordinary amount of stuff, and a lot of it's not especially necessary. We're terrible at conserving food. Terrible. We're quite good at.
I didn't get that sense from the book, but I guess you're right. That is.
Yeah,
it should have been a massive takeaway. That could have just been my own bias.
Well, I mean, it's
just being a hyper consumer.
Well, I mean, there are good news stories. Like certain things, like steel, we're really good at recycling. Other things less so. Steel's just quite easy to recycle because most types of steel are magnetic, and it is as pragmatic as that. It's basically you've got some scrap, you run it under a magnet, and the stuff that goes up you can recycle. But then the other stuff, copper's trickier. Mm-hmm. Plastics, disastrous. And the issue with plastics is that you have that's another oil product. You have so many different varieties of plastics, and certain ones, whether it's kind of thermosetting or not, certain ones just can't go in the same pot when you recycle it, and sorting it is just an utter nightmare. So, and we've all seen it as consumers. You've kind of got that plastic bottle, and it's it's the number 5 symbol, recycling, and you're kind of like, okay, well, I'll just put it in the recycling. But then if it's going in there with something that's kind of a number 1 recycling, then what happens later?
It's one of the great grifts. Yeah. Let's be honest, it's one of the great grifts. Even in Sweden, where they are so maniacal about their recycling, and everyone does it the right way, we recycle different coloured plastics.
Right, okay. Yeah, and that's important.
Then a documentary comes out last year. It follows a Swedish documentary. It follows the supply chain of the recycled plastic, it's been shipped to Romania and there's been burnt.
Yeah.
It's like, okay,
Yeah.
nice job recycling
Yeah,
it.
yeah.
Absolutely disastrous, as you say.
Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, clearly recycling plastic is a great grift.
Yes.
I would say.
It is, and the difficulty is, it kind of tends to fall down with the consumer, and so back to food. That's the issue there. We're not especially good at conserving food, but by the same token, we haven't really had to be, because we've been living, as I kind of said earlier on, enormous abundance for food. In large part, I mean, people talk about the Green Revolution, and partly that was down to clever use of different types of wheat and Norman Borlaug and stuff. But I would say probably even more so, it was down to the availability of artificial fertilizer. We forget that artificial fertilizer, which itself is created from natural gas, so you need to basically take hydrogen and react it with air, and then you get the hydrogen and the nitrogen can kind of bond together in really high pressure circumstances. Again, that I should have added that as another thing that a lot of people thought would never be possible, or there was a big challenge to towards the end of the 19th century. A lot of people were looking at how much mineral fertilizer we had, because up until then, most of the fertilizer in the world was basically either it was kind of manure or like human feces, a lot of it, or kind of urine sometimes. Or it was mineral that you get out of the ground. But it so happened that the places that you get that out of the ground, it's not that many. So there was guano, like old bird droppings essentially, that had built up over many years on an island just off the coast of Peru, the Chincha Islands. In the 19th century, we basically mined it all out. It went. And then we scattered it on the ground as fertilizer, and that was gone. Then they found there was lots of something called caliche in the ground in the Atacama Desert. But again, we mined it out, and that.
Sorry for interrupting you here, but could that the presence of that natural fertilizer to mine, would that have any correlation with the great agricultural innovations of South America?
That's a really good question.
Or is this too long of a bow to draw?
No, I mean, it's a really good. I don't have a clue.
Yeah.
I don't know. It's a great thing to theorize about. Yeah. They did what I do know.
Give me the answers
all
of
I
ancient
can tell
history.
All I can tell you is that they for a long time, the Incas, were aware of how amazing this guano was, and they, to the extent that it was. These islands were considered holy islands, and you weren't supposed to set foot on them unless you were had to do kind of various ceremonies. So, and they used them to sprinkle on the earth. But yeah, then we came along, we the West, and discovered them, and we plundered them. We took all of and it was partly for fertilizer, but actually it was just as much so it was for explosives. So nitrogen is nitrogen fertilizer, ammonia. It is an explosive as well. It's kind of the bedrock of TNT and stuff. So, but we then discovered, that Fritz Haber and Karl Bosch in Germany discovered how to take nitrogen from the air and synthesize it into something that is a physical fertilizer. And the way that you do that, as I was saying, is you take hydrogen and you kind of heavily pressurized reactor. And one of the interesting ways in which all of these materials intertwine is like only at that point were you starting to get the really strong steels that you needed to make the reactor shells that you needed to try to do these reactions. So you see the way that these things intertwine. And then as a result of that, and it took a while for it to take off and started in Germany, obviously, and Fritz Haber, incredibly controversial character. He was the first person to use chlorine gas in World War One to kind of create that as a chemical weapon, but also created this technique, the Haber-Bosch process, which we still use today, which is responsible for basically feeding half the world's population. Even if you eat organically, there's a quite high likelihood that some of the nitrogen in your body is created synthetically from the Haber-Bosch process. I would say very high likelihood, just because it gets everywhere. And the upshot of that and the Green Revolution was that the extraordinary rise in global population that we've had over the last century or half century has been sustainable from a food perspective. I mean, you could talk about the carbon perspective and all of the other kind of perspectives. But from a food perspective, we didn't run out of food. And a lot of people said we were going to run out of food. We didn't. And that is thanks to taking natural gas, because these days Haber and Bosch used coal and they got the hydrogen from the coal. These days we use natural gas because that's just a more efficient, clean way of doing it. But it relies on taking natural gas, running it through these pressurized converters, you're turning it into hydrogen, something called steam methane reforming happens along the way, and then you make this amazing stuff, ammonia, that can feed the world. And as a result, we haven't really had to kind of, clearly there are still pockets of the world where you have famine, but for the most part, this is not down to kind of crop availability. Sometimes it's drought, sometimes it's climate. More often than not, it's kind of political, or it's warlords, and it's what's going on with the politics of that nation. Generally speaking, it's not because of a shortage of fertilizer, and that's because we've gotten so good at making this stuff so cheaply. But then that brings you on to the kind of next challenge that we're facing as a civilization, as a society, as a species, which is that we are trying to get to net zero. We're aware of the damage that carbon emissions have caused. This is a source of it. It's not massive, but it's a source of it. This is a fossil fuel product. Like it or not, food we eat is basically a fossil fuel product. It really is. How are we going to wrestle with that? How are we going to be kind of rational about that? I don't see much rationality within a lot of the way that the debate is going on climate. I understand why. It is an issue of great passion for a lot of people on both sides, frankly. But we need to just be pragmatic and think about the engineering challenges as well, and also appreciate what things like natural gas have actually brought us, which is to say, 4 billion people. I mean, although again, there's two sides to that. There's lots of people who feel like the world has too many people in it, and part of the reason for that is down to artificial fertilizers. A lot of the reason, because they wouldn't have been supportable otherwise. So that's the difficulty. And go back to your question, those lines on food consumption, keep going higher. Eventually, there's a point where the global population will peak, and that's the most interesting story about demographics. It's not about that, which is what a lot of the lines that looked like they were doing recently, but it's about the plateauing, the line going up and then plateauing.
How do people project a plateau? But
that's a good question. I mean, I don't know, but
because like Peter Zeihan obviously brought demographics into everyone's what would you say? Just brought it to everyone's attention last year.
Yeah,
and it's intensely fascinating. You look at a lot of countries' demographics, like below replacement rate, and then in a lot of countries it's well above, and so you can see maybe how globally there might be population increase, but when you're talking about a rise and then a plateau, and it happens.
Well, it does, but it's happening in Japan. I mean, you look at it in Japan. You've got shrinking population, and you've got you will have shrinking populations in large parts of Europe.
I think Sweden.
Is that happening already? Yeah. So
I think Australia.
So it literally is just that trajectory of the wealthier you are, the fewer children, generally speaking, you're having, and you kind of get below the replacement rate. Look at the UK; it's definitely the case here. And then particularly if you're not having kind of immigration as much as you did before, and so the kind of bulge. We're still in the kind of upward tick of the bulge, but and it's places like Pakistan, it's places like China's certainly kind of got very poor demographics. But places like Nigeria are going to be these enormous population centres in the future, and again that's kind of interesting because these are places which need a lot more resources if they're going to get to the standard of living that we have in the West, which means more steel, more concrete, more of everything, more copper, and that's before you consider the implications of climate change and net zero.
Totally,
have more demand,
and they're also going to consume the cheapest of those products that is available to them.
Yeah.
As would we if we were in the exact same position.
Okay, yeah.
And so, yeah.
And why shouldn't they? And why should we? And this is the difficulty I have with things like the kind of degrowth arguments. I understand totally why a lot of people feel we should consume less in developed economies. I mean, we definitely buy too many cars. We get through our cars too quickly. I don't think we should have to have cars for, it's obviously nice to buy a new car, but I don't think getting a car every kind of 2 or 3 years makes any pragmatic sense. It lasts a lot longer, frankly. But so yeah, we should do less consumption, and kind of we are at the moment. But what about these nations where they just my favorite statistic? One of my favorite statistics from the book is like I work in the world of economics and data, and obviously if you're talking to development experts, one of the things they look at is GDP per capita in different countries, and that's your benchmark for how well off or otherwise a country is. My favorite is not looking at GDP per capita, but looking at steel per capita, the stock of steel in your nation per capita. I just think it gives you this kind of sense, because if you think about it, what is steel? Well, steel is your car, and if you've got two cars, that's kind of a lot of steel. Steel is the office you work in. Steel is the structure, the foundations of the city that you live in. It's the buildings, it's the houses, it's high speed rail, it's roads.
Development.
It's an indicator of development, exactly. It's bridges. You need like lots of steel and the reinforced concrete there. And the amount of steel per capita in developed economies is about like 15 tons per person. So that's how much steel that you and I, on average,
Is that a fact?
has. Yeah. So that's in our car. If you think about the items of your life, whether it's the school you're going to send your children to, or like the home.
And our fraction of that consumption.
That's our personal fraction.
That's
it's about
a great
15
statistic.
tons. Yeah.
Do you know what that is in Australia?
I think it's a good question. I assume.
I'm assuming higher.
I don't know.
Way more infrastructure for less people.
Maybe. It's a really good question. I do have the data. I've got the data set somewhere,
Right.
so I can send it to you. So I assume it's similar, maybe a bit higher. It kind of depends. Also, it's like all this random stuff. Like if you tend to have a lot more hydroelectricity, you've got quite a lot more steel because there's lots of steel reinforcement bars within dams, and so it's. And if you've got a lot of high-speed rail, that's kind of quite a lot of steel. So there's all these. There's
I love that indicator.
There's nuances, but so that's the rich world. Let's just say it's about 15 tons per person.
Yeah.
In places like China, it's about 7-8 tons per person. In sub-Saharan Africa, it's under 1 ton per person. And if you are living in sub-Saharan Africa, of course, you aspire to a world where you can have a car, where you can have hospitals. Of course you do, for heaven's sake. Where you can have schools, you can have kind of, concrete floors, you can have a reliable infrastructure around you. Yeah. And so there's a lot of the world that still needs to catch up and get to that 15 tons per person. And who's to deny anyone? I mean, it's outrageous. But the only way we have of making steel cheaply right now, and cheaply, that's the key word there, is through pretty carbon intensive methods. You take iron ore and you put it in a blast furnace. This is virgin steel because we're talking about we need lots more steel within the world for people. The only way of doing that is really carbon intensive right now. We still haven't cracked it. It's hard to envisage how we can crack that quickly. And so that's knotty. Like it's a knotty thing. But on the flip side, okay, so that's the slightly scary thing that says you still need a hell of a lot of steel in the coming years, and that's really carbon intensive. And have we kind of appreciated that when we're calculating all of these ambitious goals? Probably not. No. But the optimistic thing I take from it is that our 15 tons per capita that you and I have, our delightful 15 tons of steel, that's been pretty static for quite a while. Really? So there is, some people will argue maybe that's just because certain economies are kind of deindustrializing. So, in Germany, it looks like it's still kind of creeping up. You need lots of steel for machines and things. But it does look like there is a point where you as a person have enough steel, and we're pretty good at recycling it. In this country, we could supply all of our steel from recycled scrap, all of it. We don't at the moment. That's a whole other story about the weirdness of the British steel industry. We burn a lot of coal. It's crazy. But we could. There could be a point where we kind of reach enough. And that's kind of quite interesting, isn't it? Because maybe if you're looking out into the future and wondering about our footprint, then maybe there's something encouraging there. On the flip side,
encouraging being that it might cap
at
a certain stage, right?
That we can get to a level where we're no longer having to get quite so much stuff out of the ground. On the flip side, A steel is really easily recyclable because it's magnetic, so it's kind of a good example. B, there are so many other examples of areas where just humankind, having been seemingly satisfied and got enough of the stuff it needs, then invents this other product we all needed and never thought we needed.
Yeah.
And so as long as that happens, probably we'll kind of want more stuff. But I mean, there are definitely reasons for optimism, and I don't know where I stand on all this. I veer between being kind of pessimistic and optimistic.
You like Nassim Taleb?
What's that?
Do you like Nassim Taleb?
Nassim Taleb. Yeah, sorry, yeah.
He's
an interesting character.
I just say because from one of his books, there's this line that you cannot predict a future of infinite possibilities based off a finite experience of the past.
Yeah.
And this is all in the couching context of being fooled by randomness and again and again and again and again, misrepresenting what the future is going to be. It turns out it's fine. Turns out it's different than what you thought. Turns out we're way more resilient than you thought. Anyway, It's just like...
I totally buy that.
For this, for any talk about climate change, development, economics, I always just think about that it's nice to talk about, but the kind of, maybe the truth is, who might have said what the truth is, but maybe the truth is that it's just far too complex for any individual or even group of individuals to predict. And therefore we just roll with it and react as we go along. I mean, ever since I was in high school, people have spoken about climate change pretty drastically. And I think it's good. It's good. Everyone talks about it. Everyone knows about it. Actually, I know something crazy. I don't know how crazy this is, but I was at a grade cricketer show on Monday night. It's a local cricketer podcast, Australian guys. They had enough. It's amazing. They had enough of an audience. They've sold out an entire venue here.
Wow.
And the guest was being...
They're cackling about winning the first test in the Ashes.
Yeah, but also, the guest was making some pretty, edgy jokes. And it was really interesting to see the whole room, not laugh and be quiet. And I just took it as a signal of the...
Edgy about what kind of thing?
Climate change, girls playing in guys' sports and stuff.
Yeah.
But it was interesting because you would have thought that this was the audience who would be like, that's fucking hilarious.
Yeah.
But it was dead quiet. And anyway, I don't know why I just went to that, but thinking...
I think it is interesting. It's because the consensus has shifted. And I think, to some extent that's because, there is more evidence now of, anthropogenic climate change than we had before. The evidence is
it's hard to fight against that argument.
Exactly. I think I think as a result, what's interesting, and this is kind of something that's kind of happened, I think, in the past kind of 5 years or so, is that now there's far more attention. I think it's a good thing on how we get there. It's there is still, there's still a legitimate argument about whether setting particular goals is sensible, whether 2050 makes sense or not.
Germany spending 40 billion euros for a 5-year projection to get to zero is pissing down the drain.
Right. So yeah, and I think there's also issues in the way that Europe, for instance, is doing it. So in the US, the interesting thing about US policy right now is you've got things like the Inflation Reduction Act, which are kind of, that's a lot of money going into kind of clean tech. But then by the same token, you still have a lot of money going into fracking. And you still have the fact that the US is the world's biggest producer of oil and gas. It's an extraordinary story, crazy story.
Unbelievable
world-changing story, which, again, does not get the attention it deserves. That's part of the explanation for why the US economy, has been and continued to surprise people on the upside. It has cheap energy, and you need cheap energy to make stuff. But in Europe, it feels like, as well as having the investment in clean, tech, which actually there's probably more of than in the US if you just look at some of those numbers. As well as having that, there is an attempt to kind of suppress any fossil fuel activity, which, while I can understand the political reasons behind it, seems odd given that we are still reliant on this stuff for so much of, whether it's the gas that goes into fertilizers and this, or pharmaceuticals. And look at, as I say, one of the greatest achievements of humankind was the invention of the Haber-Bosch process. That was BASF. It was the company now is BASF. BASF has literally stopped making fertilizer at its biggest plant in Ludwigshafen. They've stopped doing it, and they're now shipping it in from elsewhere. We don't make fertilizer in this country anymore. We had one of the very first plants in the world making fertilizer, synthesizing the air, turning it into fertilizer. Extraordinary place. Aldous Huxley, when he wrote Brave New World, he based it in part on this particular plant on the northeast coast. They've stopped making fertilizer there. They're basically, a lot of it might be shut down. No one's entirely sure at the moment. And all of it's coming from America because America has cheap gas. And this stuff, it feels like a lot of the approach to this politically, and to some extent, from a corporate perspective, hasn't necessarily been rooted in rationality. It's been kind of rooted instead in a kind of black and white view of the world of heroes and villains. But the real world is far more complex and grey and interesting than that, isn't it? It's like that's so simplistic. And part of what I hope, I have no idea if this is a completely futile exercise, because I'm not like a polemicist. I'm not writing this book to try and advocate for a particular course of action. I'm just trying to lay out this stuff. One of my hopes is that maybe a few people will read it and think, okay, it turns out it is a bit more complicated than I thought. It turns out it is a bit more interesting than I thought. And it turns out that those black and white views that maybe I've been hearing a lot of about heroes and these people are the villains, maybe that was a little bit kind of premature, because this is the world I inhabit, and let's just think more about it.
Ed, we've only got 20 more minutes.
God, time flies, doesn't it?
Yeah. Obviously can't get to everything, but that's okay. There are 6 materials in the book. So
was this the conversation we were supposed to be having kind of 10 minutes in?
Yes, exactly. But heroes and villains, couple of big figures who feature in the book: Gina Reinhardt and her old man.
Yeah,
oh my God. Robert Friedland, the Copper King.
Yeah.
Aliko Dangote, the Cement King of Nigeria.
Okay, yeah.
Talk about some of the personalities behind these metals, and hopefully that will also help you talk about the maybe corruption of it.
I think what's striking what struck me looking at a lot of these materials and companies and figures is that a lot of the time, because they were some of this stuff is quite concentrated, because there were kind of few people working in these sectors. There is quite a big concentration of activity and wealth with certain people. I mean, the story of Hancock, the guy who discovered, Gina Reinhardt's father, who discovered, well, whether he discovered it or not is one of those interesting kind of questions. But he is the guy who changed the Australian story when it came to iron ore. And interestingly enough, did very little, if any, of the mining himself. He just got like a kind of finder's fee. It's an amazing deal. He got a deal, like a royalty deal on every ton of...
It's proper Wild West stuff.
It's amazing. He was flying around. He was flying around in the outback. And the story goes, it was a rainy day, and he kind of dropped down into one of the valleys as he was flying there in the Pilbara, and saw the red rock. And some of these rocks are, just incredibly beautiful banded ironstone formations. And he saw this, and supposedly then said there's iron in these hills, and he had discovered, again, question mark as to whether it was him who's discovered it, but he had discovered the world's most amazing resource of iron ore. Still is today. I mean, that's the thing, is China has tried and tried, in the same way that it's tried with semiconductors to build a semiconductor industry. It has tried to build an iron ore industry, but it's still reliant on China, on Australia. And even decades on, there's no getting away from that. The interesting thing, I mean, by the way, on Australia is just how it gets so much stuff out of the ground, but it basically just all gets refined somewhere else, which is to say China. And I just do wonder to myself, it's a fascinating kind of symbiotic relationship with China. They take the minerals, whether it's lithium, whether it's copper, whether it's iron obviously being the big example.
There's a journalist called Paul Cleary. I'm not sure if you're familiar with him, Australian journalist, wrote a book called $1 Trillion Baby.
Right.
Highly recommend
Okay.
it. It is the story of how Australia just pisses away our natural resource windfall
Right.
compared to the Norwegian economy and how they did it.
Well, yeah, I find that interesting, and I assume, but I don't. Is it? But I see. I know nothing about Australian politics, but I assume that someone knows what they're doing. But no, that's
Neither
wrong.
do I.
That's clearly the wrong assumption. Yeah, because I'm thinking about our politics in this country. But anyway, so you got like Lang Hancock and various other characters who crop up, quite a lot in the book. And what's striking is like you get these people and companies that you might not have heard of, whether it's the Concrete King or kind of Robert Friedland, who's this amazing copper kind of prospector, miner character, who's still going. I think 2, if not 3, of the world's biggest copper mines right now are ones that he discovered, and it's like including one including 2 of the biggest risers. So, like an amazing character. Yeah. Who was supposedly also like at college with Steve Jobs. Isn't that the story?
Yeah, more than at college with.
Were they flatmates or something? Or?
No, Steve discovered his hippie rebellion through Robert Friedland, and it's in Walter Isaacson's biography. It's an incredible anecdote of Steve walking into the room, Robert's having sex with somebody, and Robert just goes, "Yeah, just sit there and wait a minute." And Steve buys something off him, and Robert goes and has a cult. Like a hippie commune, right? Which sort of, and anyway, it got to the point where later on when Steve Jobs was Steve Jobs, he made a comment that, of course he's a gold miner. I would never buy anything off him. Basically a charlatan. It's so incredible because then this same guy's Ivanhoe Mines, and like you say, 2 of the 3 biggest copper mines in the world.
Yeah.
Genuinely one of the most powerful people in the world.
Yeah.
And as well, you mentioned where his mines are in the DRC.
Yep.
You don't just get one of the big mines in the DRC.
DRC, Mongolia. I think he found one in Mongolia. Oyo Tolgoi. I think he found that one as well. So yeah, it's like and actually, what's interesting about that comparison? So him and Steve Jobs. Friedland, he occupies what I guess I call like the material world. So you're getting stuff out of the ground, you're making stuff out of it. Whereas Jobs, what's interesting about what Apple became, not initially, but what it later became, is it became this kind of the perfect example of outsourcing everything. So you're outsourcing your entire supply chain, and they were kind of one of the early people to do that, and particularly with Tim Cook. So Tim Cook was the great manager of that outsourced supply chain, where everything is made somewhere else, like whether it's Foxconn, and you're managing the supply of batteries from Japan and process memory chips from somewhere else. You're managing that supply chain, but you're not actually making any of it. And that's what's kind of interesting about those 2 characters is those worlds are obviously they interact enormously, but they feel like they're kind of very different philosophies on business and how the world works. And yeah, still, so he, Robert Friedland, he's still going, isn't he? And he's still one of the most interesting characters in this space. And copper is perhaps one of the most important metals, substances in all of our lives. We don't think about copper. I feel like copper's always underrated because it's always, it's beneath the wire. It's because it's got sheathing around it. You very rarely see it except in like some classy kitchen with copper cookware. But it's so important. And there's this. You should kind of go onto YouTube and look for. There's a video of someone that has this kind of copper slab, just like a slab of copper, and they drop a rare earth magnet, so a really, really powerful magnet on it. Okay, it's just a kind of spherical thing, or rather kind of round slab. And the magnet falls down as you'd expect it to fall, so it falls fast. And then when it reaches the copper slab, it just suddenly hovers in midair before just dropping slowly. It's kind of like when you see one of the SpaceX rockets come into land. And what that underlined to me when I watched it, and I've kind of watched it so many times and thought about it a lot. And also there's other things like you kind of, put a kind of like a magnet, run a magnet through a kind of coil of copper, and again, it just doesn't plop out. It kind of slowly falls. What that underlines is just the amazing properties of an element,
Sci-fi
a straightforward metal, and it's sci-fi stuff, and that that same reaction that you're seeing when the magnet is falling, or not quite falling, when it's just slowly resting, is, that's electromagnetism. That is the power, literally the power that we're all that you're reliant on for listening to this, and that powers our world. Electricity. People talk about these different industrial revolutions, and a lot of them talk about the electricity being the second industrial revolution. It was so massive then, because you had a lot of factories that were still run on steam power, and it was a really inefficient way to run factories. And in a way, we think about light switches, and obviously light was one of the big kind of things. You went from having incredibly kind of low levels of lumens within your kind of candlelight or your kerosene bulb or whatever it was, through to having amazing kind of cheap light. So that was amazing. But so too was just everything else. Suddenly you could have motors that were far more efficient, had far more traction, so you could break down more things. You could have bigger vehicles. You could just run an entire plant, using power, invisible humming power rather than chugging power. And today, there's no one who's listening who won't kind of, when they think about it, think about those different parts of their life that one way or another are reliant on electricity, which is to say copper, because in the end, almost all of it still begins, apart from a solar panel, really, which has, by the way, a lot of copper. Almost all of the power that we're consuming right now still begins with some magnets turning around copper, or copper turning around magnets. It is the interaction of copper and magnets is the bedrock for our lives. Is another. Sorry, I've probably said everything's a bedrock of our lives. Fertilizer, copper, steel, concrete. They all are.
It's the case. They all are.
That's the point. That's what I'm banging on about. But so copper, and we need crazy amounts more of it if we're going to kind of fulfill all our ambitions.
Just very quickly, maybe talk about the Moore's law for copper. I thought that was intensely fascinating.
No, I love that. So obviously everyone's aware of what Moore's law is, the idea that each couple of years, really, each iteration of semiconductor is getting exponentially more powerful. Or these days, actually, it's less about power and more just about the dimensions, being able to fit enough. It's transistor density. And the idea is that over time we've just become better and better and more efficient at making more complex chips. And I actually read this thing from, I think it was Bill Gates, saying that, when it comes to mining, I think he was saying, there is no equivalent. But actually, it turns out there kind of is. It's just that we haven't been looking at it in the right way. Because when you look at the price of copper in real terms, it's kind of been flattish or maybe gone up a little bit over time, and that reflects the fact that we have mined out the easy stuff. Over the years, we've gone from grades of 5, 6, 7, 8%, stuff where you could really see the copper in there, to stuff that is below 1%. Really, stuff that would have been considered junk is now where we get our copper from these days. And over time, there have been so many cases, so many episodes since the 70s, the 60s, in fact, since the 1920s, where people have said, hang on, we're about to run out of this stuff. We've all heard about it when it comes to oil. Peak oil was a big thing a few years ago. It's been the same thing with copper for quite a long time. So you had it, there was limits to growth, that book in the 1970s. The beginning, in a sense, that was Earth Day. That was the beginning of the environmental movement. Well, that book, influential as it certainly was, among the many predictions in there was that we were going to run out of copper by, I think, 2022. So that didn't happen. In fact, by 2022, the total reserves, so amount of copper in the ground that we know we can get out, that we've got mines around, it's going to be okay, we're going to get that stuff. Resources, resources, by the way, is a kind of a different thing. That's the total amount there probably is in the earth, and there's plenty of copper, albeit in quite low concentrations. But the amount of reserves that we have, the amount of stuff that we've proven that we can get out of the ground, went up over that period, even though each year we were mining more and more out of the ground. So the miracle of the modern world is that we have got better and better and better and better each year at getting ever more copper out of ever less promising rock. And the kind of Moore's law on this is when you look at the number of hours it takes to get a given amount of copper out of the ground, like a ton or whatever it might be. And in Roman days, I think it was days or weeks, or maybe even like getting on for years. I can't remember the statistic. It's there in the book. But over time, that amount of time it takes us and the amount of, human power it takes to get out of the ground has diminished and diminished and diminished and diminished. And it's one of the triumphs, I think, of our species, that we now get so much copper out of the ground for ever less input. And that's a productivity miracle. It is a productivity miracle. It's just as much a miracle as Moore's law, except that it's not as sexy and it's not as evident, and no one thinks and talks about copper as much as I think they should. But that's amazing. And we did it. We did it by having, it's pretty simple, but also kind of interesting. How do we do it? We did it by having big trucks. We did it by having the first revolution in this was things like, I mentioned them a second ago, having electricity to power the big grinding mills, and then you could have bigger grinding mills to tear down the rock and turn it into kind of granulated or powdered form. Then we did it through having bigger trucks. You went from having trucks that could carry 40 tons to carry 400 tons. Those massive ones you've probably seen, in those mining sites. And they are crazy. Like, until you have been there to one of these mine sites, you just can't get the scale of it, because these things look like a normal truck. No, I mean, it's not a normal truck. The wheels are like the size of a double-decker bus almost. They are crazily big. And within the big bucket at the back, they can carry enormous amounts. And the simple improvement in the amount of rock you can carry and the scale of these refineries, which got bigger and bigger over the years, and our invention of new processes to, use chemicals and so on to leach these minerals out, has completely revolutionized the world. We would not have had... there's a question mark over whether China would have been able to develop and urbanize in the way that it has over the past kind of 20, 30 years without those trucks. The trucks are part of the reason for why we have the world we have today. They helped us. They helped to save kind of the global economy. And so those kinds of things, and it's a similar story, by the way, for like iron ore and for a lot of other mining, are one of the most extraordinary things we have done as a species. We never talk about them. We certainly never glorify them. And I can understand why, because it's really dirty stuff. It's grimy stuff, mining. And there are very big, legitimate questions over the amount of pollution it causes, and carbon emissions. And if you look at some of these places, like I went to the world's biggest man-made hole, one of two. There's a place, a mine in Chile. It's like a canyon. You stare into it and you feel vertigo on the side. It's like looking into the Grand Canyon. It's crazy. And what's even more crazy than that is the tailings dam. So the tailings is the waste from the mine. The size of the tailings dam, and bear in mind, actually, until a few decades ago, they would just chuck this stuff into the rivers and it would go down to the sea, and it would lead to terrible kind of pollution, arsenic, the whole lot. But the tailings dam they now chuck that stuff into is so big. I think the total size of it is bigger than Manhattan. Just the waste from that one mine. And in order to satisfy the goals that we have for net zero, we need another 3 mines like that every year through to 2050, which is extraordinary, and I don't know how achievable it is.
And who's to say the second, third, fourth order consequences of that ruins your net zero goal anyway? That's
the thing. I mean, like there are quite a lot of complexities that you only start to see when you kind of look from the bottom up, which is what I try to do. Makes it more interesting, though.
Yeah. But again, also, what if some brilliant engineer, scientist, physicist team of them come together and figure out a much cleaner way to treat the mines? It's
that's it.
That could be the Bosch process in a different way.
That's
There's
exactly
all these possibilities.
And I think that's more likely. That's the funny thing. So people look at, and there's a whole chapter on it, so I don't want to discount it because it's really interesting. People look at things like deep sea mining, and they wonder whether that might be the future. Although, I mean, God, we know the mess we've left on the surface. Do we really want to inflict the same thing under the sea where there's just so much less we know about it? I don't know. But again, we're all implicated in this because we need the copper, we need the cobalt, we need the nickel and the manganese and all of the other things. But while I can understand that's kind of a sexy, interesting thing, it's far more likely that we just get incrementally better in the same way that we had the bigger trucks and the better kind of chemical processes. We just get better at getting the stuff from above ground. These days you don't need human beings in the trucks. I've seen mine sites where they're operating everything out of a room, all of these remote vehicles. It's terrifying. And do we just have more productivity gains that mean we get even better, and all the stuff we now think is junk rock becomes legitimate, and that solves everything? Like, it's entirely possible, and it probably will happen. And then it'll happen in 20 years' time. Everyone will be like, "Oh, isn't it great that we never ran out of copper?" And we go, and no one, people will take it for granted in just the same way they do today, which is fine. But that's the human, that's the story of human ingenuity, and long may it continue.
Ed, mate, we didn't touch lithium. We barely touched salt, barely oil.
Okay,
it's an unbelievable book. I, thoroughly, highly recommend it. And I know it's going to be right up the alley of the audience, which as well, for me is a big reason why I was so stoked to talk to you. We've got 5 minutes left. Let's see if we can squeeze in these 3 questions. I try to ask every guest. So not material related.
All right.
First being, could you talk about the role that serendipity has played in your life?
I never had a plan for my career. I never, frankly, when I went into, I knew I wanted to write and to communicate, but I had no idea about what. And when I became a journalist, I had no interest whatsoever in covering economics. I thought it was the most boring thing in the world. I didn't want to do economics. I didn't want to do finance. I had friends that did finance. I was like, no offense, no offense to me or to you, and it just so happened, actually, I don't know if it's serendipitous, but it just so happened that was the only job that was going, and I grudgingly took it. And within, I had to do a hell of a lot of learning. I don't have an economics degree. I do now. I have like a master's. I went back to university later on. But for a long period, I didn't have any economics qualifications, and found learning it and coming from a position of total ignorance and then understanding it myself was the best route to communicating it. And serendipitously, I found that it was the most fascinating thing. And it's also, I guess, slightly kind of underserved. I'm always surprised at, because I guess a lot of people get intimidated by the topic of economics. They try to kind of keep away from it. But it's a shame because, first of all, there's a richness there that is, I think, we don't talk about enough. And secondly, I think these closed shops, it's a quite sniffy place. I remember going to bank kind of conferences, press conferences at the Bank of England, and you get kind of sneered at a bit. Really? Yeah, definitely.
As a journalist? Or as an economic journalist?
Well, as a journalist, with certainly if people doubt your credentials. And they kind of wonder whether you have an economics degree, then you get kind of sneered at. And which is crazy, but I think that's quite widespread within. And as
I'm sure you realised that, what does your economics degree even mean?
Well, I mean, having then later gone, to Harvard to study this, I kind of thought that I felt the grounding I had in, being an autodidact, self-taught, was actually more useful, certainly for the kind of economics I was doing. I wouldn't say it was useful for kind of microeconomic analysis or modelling or anything like that. But it was more useful than having gone to university to do a degree, and I studied with some of the greats.
But if you're not publishing economic theory, is it necessary to know all of the dense microeconomics?
No, well,
you could just read a few Thomas Sowell books and like Henry Hazlitt's, and all of a sudden,
totally. And exactly. You kind of look for the great communicators and the kind of counterintuitive and also the mainstream minds, and just try and get the synthesis for it. But I think that's the strange thing. We inhabit a grey area. Journalists inhabit a grey area. We are not experts necessarily, but we do talk to people who are experts. In the course of writing that book, I spoke to so many people who knew what they were talking about, because it's not really an economics book; it's all sorts of different things. And then you learn to synthesize and to communicate. And ultimately, what we're doing is just taking stuff that we think people also might like to know about or ought to know about, and just telling it in as engaging a way as possible. It's straightforward. It's just communication, but I'm just always surprised at how many under-communicated areas there are. Like this whole book could have been written, years ago. It wasn't. I was like, why is that not being written? Why is people and I don't know. Maybe it's just because there's no one else who's dull enough to kind of look at the random dull stuff that I want to look at. But So I don't know if that answers your question, but I never had a plan. So everything to me, or getting into TV as well. Everything has been a bit of serendipity, to be honest with you.
Amazing. As is which is exactly the type of response I hope to elicit from that question. Right. Because, I mean, very rarely, again, it's maybe I'm too biased, but the Nassim Taleb quote, I mean, it's like your prediction of tomorrow is hinged upon a moment of randomness that, what if there was whatever your main passion was for journalism job opening and you got it?
Yeah.
You wouldn't have written this book, almost certainly. Yeah. Because you'd be on a totally different trajectory.
Well, I would have been doing book reviews and, kind of like, twiddling my thumbs a little bit. And
right,
okay.
Think
about, I don't know, Derrida or some so thank God
so
for
it was
that.
a totally different...
Yeah,
okay,
totally. That was my other path.
Amazing, mate. Really, really fast so we can get them on the record.
Yeah, sorry.
What is a country you are bullish on?
Australia.
Amazing. Please tell me why.
Electro states. Amazing. We are living in a new kind of quest. There's a quest for natural resources. It just needs to work out. And also, standard of living in Australia. If you look at standard of living in Australia versus the UK, like we're noticing this here. Here in this country, our standard of living is collapsing. In places like Australia, in particular, it's going up. So I think I'm actually quite bullish on Australia. And it just needs to kind of do more of the value add stuff. That's the thing. It's the refining and the what are you going to make out of it. Don't provide rocks to the rest of the world. What else are you going to provide as well? I mean, I know that's a massive simplification, but it's part of it.
Yeah, I echo that sentiment completely. I think Sydney, you would be hard pressed to argue that it's not the highest standard of living city in the world.
Yeah, right.
Even with the crazy cost of living, it's still. You're paying just as much there as you are here in London. You'd rather be in Sydney than London.
It's expensive.
Okay, cool. So Australia. Okay, we won't go down that tangent.
But you'll have more to say about that than I do.
Finally, Ed, if you could witness a conversation between any two people of history, dead or alive, so a podcast, who are you listening to?
Oh my God.
No language barrier.
Oh my God. I wish you told me these beforehand, because now I'm on the spot. Golly. I mean, I have just been reading this is I mean, like I have no set response to this. I've just been reading this. Have you read The Making of the Atomic Bomb? No. It's the definitive book on that, The Making of the Atomic Bomb. Obviously there's that movie that's coming out, Oppenheimer. Yeah. That's based on the biography of Oppenheimer. But actually, this book by Richard Rhodes is extraordinary. It's one of the best things. One of the best things I've read. It's like. So have you read The Prize by Jürgen? So obviously it's like The Prize but for nuclear, and it goes through. I mean, The Prize is so good. But this kind of it sweeps through history, and it's so good. And I guess so. That period was just mental. It was just extraordinary. And so I guess I'd like to kind of listen to Niels Bohr, and I don't know, maybe Rutherford. I know this is really obscure and it's got nothing. It's like got nothing.
Yeah, who's
but
Rutherford?
So Ernest Rutherford, like he was the first guy to split the atom, and then Niels Bohr was kind of building on that stuff, and they were just living in like no one knew at the time whether when they set off the atomic bomb or when they split the atom whether the world would end. Like they were literally taking physics and completely kind of turning it upside down, and that's pretty crazy to have that on your mind. And yet, but they really sounded like interesting guys. And Niels Bohr was kind of lived in Denmark for a while during World War II and was kind of almost kind of hounded out. So they're pretty interesting. They're pretty interesting characters. But I mean, that's just like I'm afraid. If you asked the question another time, it would have been someone else. So
well, if I'm lucky enough, Ed, maybe one day we can do it again.
All right,
and then
I'll be less obscure.
No, but I think that's a terrific one. I mean, because it's relevant, it's very fascinating. The most common one we get is Jesus Buddha. I'm happy you didn't say that.
Jesus Buddha.
Yeah.
Okay,
All right, Ed.
I'll take them.
Thank you so much, mate.
Thank you. You're so good.